Just like to thank the organisers for the invitation to come along here today. I think the last time I was with this group was in the meeting in Kaikoura. So I don't know if anybody can remember when that was, but I've actually forgotten when it was. But anyway, just to kick in, what I'd like to do is just give some global context to forests before I launch into the topic of why productivity and sustainability of New Zealand planted forests is important. But forests around the world are seen as a solution to climate change, but in terms of, if you look at the many planting schemes, millions of hectares have been promised to address the impacts of climate change and meet Paris goals in 2050, but forests themselves are actually under pressure from climate change in terms of increasing temperature, risks around biotic diseases and fire. So, they're in a sort of very difficult space, I suppose, in terms of great expectation, but also under pressure. Forests are also key in terms of biodiversity. There are about 4 billion hectares of forests around the world, and 1 billion hectares of those forests are considered primary, so they have been unmodified and are seen very important in terms of preserves for biodiversity. And the key thing is that there's a lot of pressure on those forests because they contain a lot of timber. And as I'll sort of get to the point that the world is short of timber and needs more timber as the population continues to grow. And the third pressure I've got there is growing consumption. So again, we want to build more wooden houses. We want more packaging in particular, in terms of the modern age where we ship everything around the world by courier. We use a lot of cardboard for those sorts of things. But just some of the headlines that we see globally, back in a couple of years ago, there were sort of global droughts and big pressures on forests. And so people have become very concerned about what is going to happen to those forests around the world. And this is where sort of New Zealand, our planted forests in New Zealand become important. And so people are predicting a global population of about 9.8 billion around 2050. We're currently at about 8.2 billion people in the world. So we see this increasing demand for timber for construction, urbanisation of the population, and just those more wooden products. Back in 2015, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development suggested that we would need about 300% more fibre by 2050. So that was 10 billion cubic metres worth of wood that the world would be consuming a year by 2050. That number has just recently been increased to 4 times the current supply of wood. So we're talking 12 billion cubic metres of wood required by 2050 around the world. So what does that mean? More deforestation of primary forests? Is that acceptable? Not really. That would lead to sort of more biodiversity loss. We can plant more trees, but 2050 isn't that far away, 30 years. And so as we know here in New Zealand, some tree species don't grow that fast, others are a little bit faster. So we currently have about 292 million hectares of planted forests around the world. About 131 million hectares of those 292 are considered plantations, but only about 50 million hectares of those forests are intensively managed. And so people have argued that we need well over 100 million hectares of intensively managed forests to meet those growing demands. But recent papers said, well, we need something like 400 million hectares to produce that wood and fibre needs. Included a little bit there, but this just shows how our behaviours are changing. So back during COVID, we all worked at home generally. What that resulted in was less recycled paper. And so we actually, in the UK, they had a shortage of toilet paper because there was less recycled paper because nobody was working in the office printing stuff out and recycling it. And so the danger of that, people became very concerned that shortage of toilet paper was going to lead to deforestation of some of these primary forests. So you can see how tight the supply is. And, you know, here in New Zealand, we're very closely linked to the supply and demand around the world, and we can see the current downturn in China in terms of their growth has had impact on the industry. So just a bit of background to New Zealand plantation forests. We currently have about just over 1.7 million hectares of planted forest here in New Zealand. We harvest currently around 34.4 million cubic metres. Most of that is exported offshore, generates about $6.7 billion worth of export earnings. And those export earnings are still considered to grow through to about 7 billion over the next 2 or 3 years. We use a consistent amount of wood here in New Zealand, about 6.5 million cubic metres for domestic consumption. So that's, you know, building, construction, and, you know, other things that we do in our spare time, doing things around the house. And I've just included a little bit here around land use and returns. Don't want to go into it too much, but the key thing really is the incorporation of trees onto farms does increase the profitability of farming enterprises. So I think that's something we should be looking at a lot more as a country and maybe as a group to support that land use change. So when I was approached to speak here, Alec asked me to talk about productivity. And I guess there's a couple of reasons for why we should be focusing on productivity. It's all around, you know, producing more per hectare of land, so that efficiency of production to remain internationally competitive. There is this concern, at the moment I'm working on a project with Alec and colleagues, but around this static sort of productivity of our primary sectors. And, you know, here for the forest industry, back in 2012, they established a goal of doubling productivity by 2030, and we're nearly there, and we haven't doubled productivity. So, you know, what's sort of going on? We've got the issue of decreasing profits as well, because costs of shipping and oil and all these other consumables within the forests are going up. And so we need to be more efficient with our productivity. And, you know, again, we're also seeing this increasing environmental challenges and change occurring, which is impacting on our primary sectors. And then, you know, the key one really, this land use competition. We've seen a lot of land use change here in New Zealand over the last 10 years, so deforestation, afforestation, so that's a fairly fluid and dynamic place. But key thing for New Zealand, we do these wood supply predictions every now and then. This one was done around sort of early 2010-11, but it predicted what they call the wall of wood. And I'm sure you've all heard about that we planted a lot of forests in the early 90s, and those forests have matured. We're maturing in the early 2030s. And so the industry anticipated this, and we actually saw quite a large increase in harvesting back around 2016, and that's carried on to today. And the red line is the original forecast, and you can see how it didn't actually start to dip until sort of mid-2030s. In fact, that dip is predicted to happen a lot sooner. So we've actually got into harvesting those forests earlier and at a higher rate, and so we are going to see quite a decrease in the amount of wood that is going to be available here in New Zealand in the not too distant future. That's got all sorts of implications in terms of jobs, exports, and maybe something to do with carbon, depending on what happens with carbon prices and the ETS and everything like that. But so this is an important reason to focus on productivity, because we're going, you know, potentially going to lose a big source of revenue for the country. From a company point of view, you know, they have to look at their long-term survival as a business. So how can they do that? They can do that by increasing their productivity. That's got all sorts of implications for environmental outcomes in terms of if they use fertiliser or if they go to shorter rotations, more disturbance, potential for more sediment. So there's a lot of issues all sort of coming together around this sort of change in the wood flow long term. So also what else is changing? So I put this slide together recently for a visit to China, but I first went to China about 12 years ago. And when I went there, the atmospheric CO2 concentration was 394 parts per million. April this year, it's gone up to about 427. So that's a 8.5% increase in the atmospheric CO2 concentration. So what impact is that actually having on the productivity of our primary sector ecosystem? So we've also got at the same time people saying we're exceeding this 1.5 degrees on average temperature increase. And you know, the trick with that is that's an average. It's not actually describing some of those maximums or minimums, extremes in weather that we're seeing. And so this is really important to understand what the impact that change in CO2 and the feedbacks into the climate system is actually having on our primary sectors, and then whether or not we're going to be able to meet some of these increased demands that we face in the future due to growing consumption and growing population. So, you know, there's a lot of unknowns there at the moment. One of the things that was put forward a while ago, and is probably current, but they talk about this progressive nitrogen and probably phosphorus deficiency as a result of dilution of nutrients due to this extra uptake of atmospheric CO2. So, and that's got all sorts of implications. I won't talk about that because I think Dave's going to touch on that in his talk. But for forestry, what it means is that the litter that's cycled within the forest is of poorer quality, and so we will start to see, or maybe seeing, a slowdown in the cycling and availability of nutrients to drive the extra sort of growth from the elevated CO2. And as we sort of, I guess, fix more carbon, tie up more nutrients, you know, the available nutrients are going to become less and less unless something else happens, you know, increased weathering because of changes in temperature and moisture cycling, but that's a research topic for itself. So the question is, are we actually already seeing this progressive nutrient deficiency? I'm just sort of throwing something out here, but this is an image out of a paper that Mackay was the lead author with a colleague, John Moore, but John had been looking at the long-term productivity of Kaingaroa Forest, our largest production forest in New Zealand, based on a few plots that they'd measured there. The red line basically represents a declining productivity in that forest. So we're sort of developing a MB Endeavour fund to start to look at these issues, and Dave's going to talk about the pasture side of it. Just want to make the point really around the importance of soil fertility to back up those ideas around the progressive nutrient deficiency. But this is data from the Lucas data set. So they've sampled forests around the country and looked at soil properties, how productive those forests are, but we've divided it into unimproved forests and improved ex-pasture sites. So you can see about a 20% increase in productivity if you plant your forests onto ex-pasture sites. You can see the big differences in the fertility there in terms of total nitrogen, phosphorus, available phosphorus. And I guess why this is important, that if you look at the benefits from tree breeding, so if we plant range of different genotypes on poor sites through to high sites, we can see we get the biggest gain in productivity by planting our best genetics on the best site. So, you know, and that's reflecting the need for fertility in those improved genetics. So, and this is just to show some other work that John has been doing within Kaingaroa, but this is looking at fertiliser applications, not just nitrogen by itself, but a balanced blend of fertiliser. So John presented this data back in 23, but you can see that they've had up to over 50% response to balanced nutrition. So rethinking the way we apply nutrients to forests is probably going to be important going through, but they were also concerned around the environmental impact, so they set up lysimeters and looked at the leaching under the different rates because they're very concerned about the potential for nutrient leaching, particularly if they start fertilising on a large scale. So how sustainable are forest soils? Graham Will made a prediction back in the early 60s for Kaingaroa that based on some simple bioassays that he did with the soils there at the time, that there were probably about 2 rotations worth of nutrients in the tank at Kaingaroa. So again, we're into the 3rd rotation. Are some of these trends that John's shown actually backing up the ability of these sites to supply nutrients without added nutrition? And the graphic at the top basically shows that by about 2045 we'll be moving into the 5th rotation of radiata pine on some sites in New Zealand. So we're sort of at the point now where we're heading into the big chunk of our planted forests in New Zealand are in their 2nd rotation, heading towards their 3rd, and we're getting an increasing proportion of forests in their 3rd and 4th rotation. So you can imagine a rolling front going through. So, we need to start thinking longer term around how we manage the nutrition of our planted forests. So this question, how sustainable are our forest soils, has been a focus here in New Zealand since sort of the mid-80s, and that sort of dates back to the first oil shocks. I don't know if people can remember that, carless days and, sort of lining up at the petrol station on a Friday night, filling up your tanks for the weekend. But that was when we were starting to consider the use of forest biomass for biofuels way back in the late 70s. And I guess it's ironic that we're sort of back to that point in time now where people are eyeing up the biomass residues within forests and actually starting to remove them. So impacts of management on the sustainability of forest soils are important. So with great foresight, we as predecessors established what we call our long-term sustainable productivity trials, but these were established from the mid-80s onwards, and that was to look at the impact of harvest residue removals and whether or not we could replace those harvest residue removals with fertiliser. So these trials, I guess, coming back to Sue's point, 30-year science system, 30-year research infrastructure, it's a long time. So by hook or by crook, and some of that stuff you were referring to, Sue, about, we just hide stuff in the overheads. We kept these trials going for 30 years, which is really good. I just I'm not going to go into the details too much because I have no idea how much time I have to speak, but just want to make the point that not all sites are the same. Really, they have different stocks of nutrients on a range of soils. We have 15 soil orders here in New Zealand, and 8 of those are commonly used with forestry. So point is, one size doesn't fit all. So you do need to know site specific information. And key point is that nutrient removals impact most on those poorer sites. So recent sandy soils, some of the volcanic soils, but other sites, even in Berwick on the Golden Downs, Woojeri gravels, there's still quite a lot of nutrients stored in the deeper soil profiles. So we need to think a little bit differently about how those deeper soil resources are contributing to forest productivity in particular. So just a couple of key things. We had a treatment in there where we sort of whole tree harvesting and removal of the forest floor, and that was to maximise biomass removal for use for other things. But we did see that where we removed the forest floor, that it did recover. So we did build up a forest floor over the next rotation there. And whole tree and stem only removal were not significantly different. So taking the tops of the trees branches and needles as well as the stem, and comparing that to stem removal did not impact productivity across the trial series. But what we did see, even though we recovered the forest floor, soil carbon and nitrogen decreased under that whole tree phosphor removal. That is quite an extreme treatment. If you can imagine, this broom covered, 20 centimetres worth of forest floor, taking the whole lot off just down to the carpet. It's quite extreme. So can forest soils keep supplying nutrients? Based on those 30-year trials, what we did show was where we kept the forest floor intact, things were pretty good. Mineral fertiliser application is not the same as the organic matter. So if you remove organic matter, okay, you can build up the stocks of nutrients through fertiliser application, but organic matter has a number of other roles in the forest ecosystem. So that's really important, particularly when it comes to the soil biodiversity. And I guess, just that sort of fertiliser is not organic matter. That's the key message to get across. So looking ahead, if we're going to remove forest residues over multiple rotations, we do need to think about what we're doing to those soil organic matter pools. So just sort of changing tact a little bit, just wanted to briefly talk about global change effects on what I'm calling soil forming factors. But coming back to that topic of increasing CO2, what's that going to do to nutrient availability long term? The impacts of increasing temperature and variation in soil moisture is going to... Oh, I've got 1 minute left. So anyway, lot of impacts of climate change and soil processes, which will ultimately affect the long-term development of soils and the properties that those soils have. And just something, this is a headline out of The Guardian, published a few weeks ago, but it's a report about a scientific piece of research, which the concern was that the scientists had observed that trees and land absorbed almost no CO2 last year. So there is a concern that globally that this big carbon sink of land and forest and all those ecosystems is actually starting to fail now. So that's, coming back to what I was saying before about those pressures on forests globally, we do need to be thinking about things now. What's on the horizon? This is an image from Lake Taupo Forest Trust Forest, but they lost about 6,000 hectares of forest, not quite instantaneously, but during Cyclone Gabrielle. So, we are actually starting to see large-scale disturbances here. And we had Cyclone Eta back in 2014, which lost about 20,000 hectares of indigenous forest on the west coast. And I won't talk about that. In conclusions, it really comes down, what do we want out of our forests? Do we want timber and fibre resources, biodiversity, carbon sequestration? What is it? We want food, potentially. So we will need more forests to offset the impact of climate change and to meet this complexity of need. So I'm not going to say what species to plant, but we just need more forests around the world. I do think we need riskier research with that 30-year timeline, so that we invest in research today that helps us address emerging questions in the future. And forests may not be growing as much as we think. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak.